Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the AltMed podcast. Great to have you with us once again. And if you are enjoying this, please hit subscribe wherever you're getting your podcast feed. We really appreciate all the support. As always, I'm here today with my co-host, Mitch Kurtz.
Hello.
And hey, Mitch. And it
Hello.
is our great collective pleasure to welcome to our podcast today Clare Barker from Entoura. Welcome, Clare.
Hello, really pleased to be here tonight.
Yeah, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here. There's a great rap that you get in the community. Everybody knows your name, and you're a big player in the Australian cannabis space. So we're very excited to chat with you tonight.
Oh, thank you. And it's an amazing that kind of sits a little bit odd with me because I still think I'm a baby in the cannabis world because I've really only been in it since 2017. But it is something I'm massively passionate about and have jumped 2 feet in, no holes barred. And I have spent a lot of time trying to educate myself and about all aspects of what we do here in Australia.
Well, 2017,
Fantastic.
I think, has you as a bit of a pioneer in the space, really. We've been legal since mid-2016, thereabouts. So one of the true, early pioneers in the space. Can you maybe, before we dive in, I know Mitch and I've got a bunch of questions for you, but can you take us through your background, how you got into this space and all your time at CSL as a quality control? Anyway, I won't ruin the story, but talk us through it.
Yeah, look, so it is a bit of an interesting story, and I do think I'm probably unique. My background is a little bit unique for someone who's running a medicinal cannabis company because I do come out of pharmaceutical, biopharmaceutical and human injectables. So there's not a lot of people who have that background and from the quality front. But I left uni, I did a science degree at uni and didn't really know what I wanted to do, but explored that and ended up at CSL and quite literally on a 3-month contract, washing bottles for their influenza manufacturing process. I left there nearly 20 years later on their executive, like the Australian executive team on global committees and working very much had spent time in the commercialisation of their influenza vaccine. So an amazing place to project a career from.
Goodness me. Did you have any emergency pandemic vaccine preparations to get involved with during your time, or?
Absolutely, we did. And that's a really amazing thing for me. That's been the surreal part of this. One of the big parts of actually working through CSL and actually getting the government contracts for CSL is you always have to have a pandemic plan. So I've spent many years, many hours working through pandemic plans, worked through the swine flu rollout, worked with the US government, and we had pandemic stockpiles for the US government, pandemic stockpiles for the Australian government, all the plans of which staff would be able to turn up to work and which ones couldn't, what hotlines we would run, how it would do. And one of the things that's been amazing to me that I've experienced a pandemic and I'm not, and A, it wasn't influenza, and B, that I'm not got anything to do with it apart from being in the community.
Well, you probably
you did have some of those coveted SOPs that the cannabis industry loves so much these days, though.
Oh, I was the queen of SOPs. You are correct.
Queen of SOPs, queen of dealing with government affairs and everything like that. And so, I think I saw.
And I think that's been amazing because, and then I then took either a career break, my first retirement, but I took 2 years off work.
Oh,
so
the dream.
It was a really, honestly, the role that I had at CSL was really challenging, fantastic, but it was actually kind of very, very draining. The opportunity came where they split their businesses and it meant that it was a really good time for me to part ways, and we part ways very well. I got a fond place in my heart for CSL. Mm-hmm. And I, at that point in time, really wanted to work out what I want to be when I grew up. And decided that I would take some time off to work that out. And I thought I'd take 12 months off, but it turned into be 2 years and 1 week.
Maybe we need to take some time off, Andrew, to figure out what we want to be when we grow up.
I want to be a podcast host.
All right, keep working at it. You'll get there.
You're living your dream.
Maybe one day. Oh dear.
Yeah, and so after the 2 years, I actually really thought I would branch out and kind of move away from that kind of sector altogether. But an opportunity came up to work with Professor Ian Brighthope at his company, which was Nutrition Care. So that Nutrition Care was his business, which he generated, which was manufacturing vitamins, minerals, probiotics. And that was for his own brand as well as contract manufacturing. So it was an amazing opportunity to actually run a business end to end. And I knew, even though my background at CSL was quality on paper, because of the experience and the opportunity that was afforded to me, I considered myself to be a business manager. And so Ian took me on, and I actually managed to manage his business for him, which was an absolute blast, bringing in the sales and marketing side all the way from supply of materials to manufacturing. And when I was with Ian, one of the things is that in order for that business to grow, he needed to take on extra partners, etc. So went through to a business sale with him, and that happened in like September of 2016, right exactly at the time that medicinal cannabis was legalising here in Australia. So I did about a 12-month period of co-general managing to hand over that business to someone from the parent company, and stepped into a business development role. Because Ian has always been, like, he's plant-based medicine. That's the reason why he started that company. He's got some really strong history with this. And he'd even worked, and he tells about this with Sir William Keys, and actually helped him access the medicinal cannabis for his end of life, and has strong ties with John Eastling, Amazon John, who'd got him very excited about medicinal cannabis or cannabis. And so I went to a BD role to see how, if any way, Nutrition Care could step into the medicinal cannabis world. And through that full analysis, there was multiple options that were worked through, but essentially Entoura was born from that. So it was determined that it was better to run as an independent company from the parent company, and so Entoura stepped out into an independent company. But yeah, so that was the genesis of it. And the decision that we made with Ian was that his experience was as a physician, as a doctor who was in an integrative medicine space, whole of health, and actually formulation development, the clinical trial element, the education element, and that doctor-patient interface. And so we decided that we would partner backwards and actually purchase or source our materials from other partners who are doing the growing and cultivation, and we would concentrate on the end that we were very good at. And so that's Entoura, and we essentially had our product. It was a very long wait to get our first products on the market. We were out there educating from September of 2017, and we didn't get our first product into Australia until August of 2018. We've
heard about these long wait times. Yeah, absolutely. And there's so many questions I want to ask you about that, but I do want to quickly cover just a little bit. So there is a bit of a story in your own personal experience within that sector, or within the plant medicine world, should I say. Very interested in hearing a little bit about that before we get to the more businessy side. I'd love to hear a little bit more of the human side that we sometimes get caught up in.
Yeah, look, it is an interesting one. So that's one of the things, I suppose, part of the story comes back to. People were very surprised that I went into that complementary medicine space after being in human injectables. It was almost like going to the dark side. But as I've said, I've always had a bit of a belief in what I affectionately say the woohoo. But I mean more than that. I've actually always had a strong belief in plant-based medicines, in the natural therapies, in yoga and different elements of that. And one of my journeys is that I've spent a lot of time, and it's a family trait, of not doing very well at sleeping. So sleeping hasn't been my best thing. And it's a funny other side story, but it's one of the things that got me into watching Formula One. So I'm a bit of a Formula One addict, and that is due to insomnia. But one of the things is I'd never actually spent any time with an integrative doctor. And so at the end of 2018, I decided that I'd had enough and I really wanted to spend time and go to an integrative doctor. It was an amazing experience, and I've never had a first consult with a doctor that lasted an hour. And I'd written a 4-page medical history, and I thought that I'd given everything out. She pulled stuff out from me that I hadn't even remembered. But the long and short of it is that she was actually able to prescribe medicinal cannabis for me, so a CBD product, Entoura's CBD product, and that was for insomnia. And the really interesting part of that is that I've never tried a prescription medication for insomnia, and because I'm genuinely worried about the side effects. You hear about all these still knocks and all of those kind of side effects, and my element is I still need to function really well. So I can't afford to have that brain fog the next morning as a consequence of getting good night's sleep. And the good thing, I suppose, because of my background, I didn't expect to go in there and for the CBD to knock me out and all of a sudden have an amazing night's sleep. But it genuinely worked. It worked well for me. And what it did, I suppose, is it just put my body into a state that actually was receptive to sleep. So it's an amazing thing. So I've been on CBD since, February of last year. Perfect timing, just before the pandemic hit. And the other kind of element of that story is so we went through, it's a really tough time in a small business, being in Melbourne in the lockdowns, trying to transition through last year. It wasn't an easy task at all, particularly when your business is facing doctors face to face and you're not allowed to. And it was about later in the year, for some reason, there was a trigger, but I went off the CBD for a few weeks. And can I tell you, people started to irritate the hell out of me. And I hadn't realized it, went back on the CBD and they stopped. So I think it was really fortuitous for me, just generally my disposition and lack of getting stressed across that really tough pandemic, running the business in the pandemic time, that I had actually been on the CBD.
Yeah.
And
two thumbs up from me on that.
We hear that story a lot where people are like, I'm not sure if I'm actually really experiencing the CBD. For people that don't have certain chronic illnesses, for example, that might have tried it and they're like, I'm not sure if it does a lot. And then they really realize it when they stop. That's when they seem to have
and also the point you raised, Claire, I think about just how, because people have asked me, and I'm prescribed CBD as well, but people have said, if I take it, is it going to, for sleep, how does it work? Does it zonk you out? Do you really just get a brick wall? And I've sort of described that it's more, at least for me, anecdotally, and I infer from what you said, that it induces a state of calm. So it enables you to be in a place where sleep would be a little bit easier, but it's not exactly acting like a full-blown sedative, like a still knocks or anything like that, that's going to just knock you, into space.
Yeah, and I suppose the hard part is I don't have that comparison to your still knocks or anything because I was so scared of taking them. But the interesting thing for me was that, if I did take it in the morning, I did feel I was drowsy. The little complication is one of the other things that came through last year was I was diagnosed with severe sleep apnea. So that was another consequence. And I'm now on a CPAP machine and my world has changed a further step from there. Yeah. I did not know what a good night's sleep was until the middle of last year. Even with the CBD. So from that start, it wasn't knocking me out, but it was at least allowing me to rest and actually get into a state where, and I suppose it's like the whole thing about that people have to remember is that we've got our own endogenous endocannabinoid system. So you're not looking at putting a drug in for your system to fight with, you're actually just looking to balance your own system. Yeah. So I think that's one of the other reasons you look at it too, is you're just helping your body get back into its own natural balance.
And I think definitely the fact that you're not going to get a whole range of really heavy duty side effects, like waking up super groggy. I've never heard of anyone doing that. But I'm curious actually hearing you say that you're getting a good night's sleep, how you're managing to watch all these Formula One events that are on in the middle of the night in Europe. And I got to admit, I think I go the other way with Formula One. I've never understood it, and I think watching it actually sends me to sleep. No disrespect to your interest.
So, well, funny you say that, because what got me into it was, and again, obviously, this is you think your brain ticks over. Sunday night was almost my worst night's sleep. Obviously, thinking about the work week, and back before digital TV and anything like that, the Formula One wasn't actually played live. It was actually played always about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and that was when I was awake. So that was the only thing that was actually putting me was there. But there was a period when I knew my sleeping was getting better because I wasn't seeing the end of the race. Right. And I can tell you that now that there's two things. Sometimes I don't see the end of the race. I fall asleep before it finishes. But other times, depending on what time it is, I actually just I do an actual media blockout for 24 hours. Make sure I don't find out what the race results are, and then I watch it the next evening.
But more importantly, what are your thoughts on V8 supercars?
Yeah, see, totally ambivalent. It hasn't turned me into a total rev head. It's just Formula One.
And isn't it always the same result anyway? Lewis Hamilton wins every time.
Yes, it has. It certainly has been mostly that, though it's a little bit different this year. Though being an Aussie, following Dan Ricciardo's been a bit tough this year. Yeah. Anyway.
When you said F1, I thought you meant female genetics. That's what they call them, F1, F2, F3s.
No, I'm nothing anywhere near as scientific as that.
But you are actually, it's a great segue here, you are actually educating doctors and talking about the science quite a lot in your field of work. And I'd love to hear a bit more about that and the function, because we haven't had anybody really speaking about, how do doctors get educated in Australia? How do they find out about cannabis? Where do they go? How do they learn? All that kind of thing, patient advocacy, these types of things.
Yeah, look, it's been a really interesting journey. And as you said, look, I wasn't quite there at the start, but pretty close to the start of that process here in Australia. And one of the things we've always got to remember is this is an unapproved medicine. So there's no advertising of it. And your rules are that you can't actually even approach doctors. You need the doctors to seek you out to actually be able to get the education from yourself. So it's a bit of a conundrum to say, okay, well, how do they know about you if you're not allowed to talk to them about it? So, and then we've always talked about the education of doctors in the same way you talk about your tech space. I know that sounds a little bit odd, but you've got your early adopters, and then you've got to go through that whole adoption curve. And that's one of the elements we had to work on to start off with was how do you get good quality education to doctors, and a lot of skeptical doctors as well. And I think I had a real naivety about myself when this first started, because I thought, well, you're going to have your older doctors who are going to be really conservative and they're not going to be interested. And of course, the newer doctors, they're going to be really open-minded and they're going to be really looking at what's my next best thing that I can give to my patients. And I'm using generalizations here, so please don't think this is all doctors in those categories. But I found exactly the opposite. It was actually the younger doctors who said, well, if this had been the case, why did they not teach me that in med school? No, I've been taught in med school, it hasn't been there. Whereas your doctors who've been practicing for 20 years or so, they'd had those experiences where they'd tried everything for their patients and things weren't working. Their answer was, what have I got to lose? Because what I'm doing with my patients now is not working. I'm not improving their quality of life. And in some respects, I don't know whether the cure is better than the actual ailment type of thing. So that was one of the things, is actually understanding the doctors. But so we do it via a lot of webinars. We also produce really high quality materials, and I'm really, really proud of what we've done with Entoura right from word go. We worked with someone who you've had on your podcast. We've worked with Kylie O'Brien.
Oh, yeah, she's
worked
fantastic.
with us to do very technically, scientifically based, what we call condition overviews. So for anxiety, PTSD, talked about the disease condition, looked into the science behind it. So what was there from animal studies? What was there from human studies? What did it say, the good and the bad? And then looked at dosing, et cetera, and full referencing. So that was a basis of us going out to doctors that we had initially for the most prevalent conditions, a real scientific base behind what we were talking to them about. And another element that was really interesting, back in, I think it was late 2017, Ian, myself, and our then head of quality at Nutrition Care actually visited John Skerritt up in Canberra. Alongside it was Bill Turner, who was the head of ODC at the time, and then Dr. Greenaway, who was his medical advisor. And the topic was to talk about patient access, because Ian was quite furious about the level of patient access, and also about the way it's regulated here, that it's regulated as a full pharmaceutical product. Apart from the fact that Ian and John had a nice little, it's a plant medicine, it's a pharmaceutical, it's a plant medicine conversation for about 3 or 4 minutes. And they actually get along really well. So it was, then they said, look, yeah, we'll agree to disagree and move on. One of the things that came out was about how to get better access. And what they then explained to us is something I didn't know about at that time, which was called an authorized prescriber process. And that is where someone who is actually who is actually experiencing a particular medicine, so it's not a specific medicinal cannabis, it's a set program or set up in Australia. If they're actually experiencing prescribing that unapproved medicine, they can apply to a Human Research and Ethics Committee to actually become an authorised prescriber, which allows them to nominate certain conditions, certain age groups and certain products that they're authorised to prescribe without having to go to TJ every time. And that gives them that ability to write a script. They have to do 6 months reporting up to TGA, but it does take a layer of that bureaucracy out of things. And they basically said, we've got 27 urologists in New South Wales as APs at the moment, but that's the way people can go. And they kind of challenged us to what to do. And they kind of said, we'll make that happen. And I don't think they thought we would. Well, Ian and I took that challenge on and went, well, how can we make this happen? And Ian's got a really strong connection with NIM, the National Institute of Integrative Medicine down here in Melbourne. And NIM actually have a HREC, so they have a Human Research and Ethics Committee. So he went and approached them and said, well, how do you feel about setting up to be able to review and approve authorised prescriber applications? And again, Kylie O'Brien happened to be the head of education at the time. And she said, well, talk to me about this. So I talked Kylie through the process of what that meant and the actual regulatory element of it. And quite rightly, she said, well, we're not going to approve these people unless they've got the right education. So she then worked with NIM, ACNIM and NICM to put together the first RACGP Class 1 accredited points, a 2-day program, which included theoretical education, case study stuff, an amazing program at the time, which was called MCE. So that's a long way to say that one of the ways of getting good doctor education is independent bodies putting real, and they got together prescribers from overseas, so people who were actually experienced from Canada and from the US to come and talk about the prescribing. It got Australian doctors who were early adopters talking about case studies. And that is one of the best ways to do it, is get doctors in a room, present experts to them, and I'll actually let them talk about stuff. So that's one of the best ways of doing it. And I'm really proud that we had something to do with that, and the fact of how many APs there are in Australia now.
That is, honestly, and I don't want to, you know, kind of be too sycophantic in saying this, but I don't want to gloss over that as an achievement, because just hearing from the community of, you know, recreational users, people maybe getting black market CBD oil, access is obviously just such a prevalent theme which won't go away in Australia until more barriers come down. And that authorized prescriber pathway, which you played such an integral role in its sort of formative stages, has actually really improved not just the number of people that have probably come forward to get it, but I think it's because word gets out that, okay, we actually have a few doctors in the community who are specialists. They're, you know, understood by the TGA to be authorized prescribers, so they know a thing or two about prescribing cannabis medicine. And the benefit is, if you go and see that doctor, they can do the script and you can get that filled straight away. You don't need to sit there and wait as a patient while your, you know, special access scheme on a case-by-case basis is determined and approved or rejected by the TGA. And on that point, I think you played a role, didn't you, in sort of some guidelines around, because one of the things for listeners out there who are maybe going and seeing their local GP who isn't an authorized prescriber, that person has to, under the regulations, apply to the TGA for you to have medicinal cannabis. And as part of that application, they need to provide the TGA with a clinical justification. And that's in your wheelhouse, Claire. What did you do in the clinical justification space?
So on that, so it's a really interesting one, because it's one of those ones where now I can get given some symptoms and stuff from a doctor, and I could write up your clinical justification, and sometimes I feel, oh my God, am I stepping over into a medical field? But when you learn as much as you do and have the conversations, you do learn a lot about it. And that was part of, I suppose, the process, because the first GP in Australia to get an AP approved, I actually worked with her on her application. So that was a really lengthy task, the research to do it, all that. And it took a long time to get that approved. So, but I'm really proud. She's a really great doctor, and I was really pleased to be able to work with her. But it was a process, and TJ had a lot of questions. But through that, I suppose it's also through my background, is from being in the quality department and leading a quality team, I have had to face TGA, FDA, auditors all the time, writing dossiers, writing audit reports. I still think even however many years out, 6 or 7 years out of CSL, I'm still probably have hosted more TGA audits than anyone in the country. That's not necessarily a good thing, but I was in charge of quality through a relatively interesting time when the vaccine had actually caused adverse reactions in children. So it was a really tough time. And we were actually audited by TGA once a month at that point in time. So
yeah, the anti-vaxxers writing all about CSL's
vaccine. It was actually not the anti-vaxxers. I hate to say it was actually a particular journalist at the Australian that I got up my nose a little bit. But anyway, let's move on from that. It taught me not to believe everything you read.
Almost like you can't trust, you know, the mainstream, you know, the Herald Sun, the Age, anyway.
The Murdoch media.
Interesting. But yeah, look, from that process, what it has done is I've got a long experience in actually understanding what the TGA is looking for, whether it's from a regulatory perspective or from this clinical perspective, in writing your clinical justification, because what you're having to do. And so I run, one of the webinars I run myself is actually how to write that clinical justification. So setting out some of your guidelines, really talking to doctors about the importance of it. And it's quite interesting because it's about a 35, 40-minute webinar I run, and I go, oh my God, do people think, and I go through in a really step-by-step process, and I think, oh, do people think this is going to be so long? But once a doctor gets into the flow of it and they know what they're doing, it can take you 5 minutes, because it's really just a summary of your clinical notes, but it's how you put those together to give TGA the assurance that you know what you're doing.
Yeah. One of the things that keeps getting talked about, sorry to jump in, Mitch, is just that I know you brought it up previously on the show, actually, this is a topic of your interest, but the first line therapy, this point around, if you want to get medicinal cannabis, let's say as a patient for treating anxiety, sleep disorder, something like that. So I've just got a guest dropping in here in the background. If you've got, someone coming in for that, they need to have failed at a first line therapy that's more of a quote unquote conventional medicine. Maybe, for example, like an SSRI in the case of anxiety or depression, that's a registered and approved medicine. What can you say about that?
Look, so it can't be a first line treatment, that's correct. But most people think that means that it has to be, they have to have tried all other treatments. That's definitely not the case. Look, and I will say there is an exception with that. With children with epilepsy, there is a relatively defined process and certain numbers of different medications that they have expectations of children with epilepsy that they have tried. But if you put that aside, the answer is the doctor, this is a risk-based approach. And if you as a doctor can explain the reason why you want to try this with a patient, and I said, I'm the classic example. I had tried complementary medicines, I'd tried sleep therapy, I'd tried a few of those type of things, but I had never tried any actually pharmaceutically prescribed sleep medication. But because my history of what I had tried, because of my choice as the patient, that I had reasons why those medications were not going to be suitable for me. The facts of what was done was presented, and that doctor was an experienced cannabis clinician. There's no question about that. She presented that in the clinical justification and was able to get me approved.
Yeah, I've heard this. I've heard that even, for example, to do with people suffering from chronic pain, for example, you might find situations where they've not really tried any first-line therapies, maybe Panadol, say, but then they have, say, an addiction profile. So they don't want to try, codeine or any opiates in that form. So they're actually allowed access just based on that kind of justification. I guess you could say that paracetamol is a first-line therapy.
Well, it is. Paracetamol is a first-line therapy, so that's it. And again, I don't mean that anyone who's tried paracetamol is going to get approved for medicinal cannabis. It's not that simple.
Yeah.
But it isn't as difficult as people think, and it's very real. Like you talk about opioids. I'm actually talking at the Addiction Australia conference next week and just presenting an overview of medicinal cannabis, and we've put together a flyer on this. But with opioids, it's actually it's counterintuitive to use opioids for chronic pain, because the more opioids are used, the more your body gets used to them, and you need more of them. So you're never actually, the opioids on a long-term basis are never actually going to be effective for chronic pain. They're very great in an acute setting, but they're not the right answer. And I think listening to your podcast with Stephen Chalk, he really explained well about why cannabis is a great solution for pain.
Yeah. Because
I mean, I think it was, I don't want to take his words directly out of his mouth, but his inference was most of the current treatments just aren't effective long term.
Yeah, totally. That's one of the major reasons we see a lot of people coming across to cannabis, is because they've been dealing with lots of side effects. It's like almost choose your medicine based on which side effects you like the least in a lot of more serious medication settings, and then you need to balance. You might have muscle spasticity, so you might have pain, you might have decreased sleep, so you now need to have, and you might have anxiety around that. So you're taking one medication for each of these indications, and all of a sudden you've got one medication in medicinal cannabis that can attack almost these three-pronged or multiple areas at the same time. And that's why we're seeing an influx, and we see the demand, outstripping supply.
Look, and that's a story we get back all the time. And so one of the things is we get a lot of really positive patient stories back, and I can tell you, I still get goosebumps when I hear them. So that's how much I love what we do.
Yeah.
And I think it comes back down to that. Look, there's a massive polypharmacy because of, and again, I come out of CSL, big pharma as such. So I'm very much got a belief in pharmaceutical medicines in their place. But I also believe that we've got a little bit blinkered in our thinking about that it's a one-to-one relationship. Here's my problem, here's my drug, let's treat. And what I love about cannabis is it's actually looking at the whole of the body. You're actually looking at trying to balance your own system again. You're looking at complementing what your body naturally wants to do to potentially improve your endocannabinoid tone, those type of elements. So, and one of the things that we're actually noticing too, and this is one of the things with I talk about when I talk about doctors about setting expectations with patients, is that you really have to think about this as a quality of life treatment, not necessarily a treatment for the condition you've been approved for. Because you might only get your pain scores down from a 9 to a 6, so you've still got residual pain. But as you said, Mitch, you're not as anxious about it. You're not worried, am I going to get to sleep tonight because my pain is going to be too heavy? Are you worried that you're going to zone out in a meeting because the opioids you've got are going to make you a little bit spacey? People end up saying, yeah, my pain scores are only a 6, but gee, I'm interacting with this. I'm talking to my son or daughter more. I don't care about going out. We had a patient, she happens to be down in Warrnambool, that she started going out for lunch again, which presented a new problem for her because she was taking it 3 times a day. She was taking a lunchtime dose. She hated taking her oral out with her. She tried to not have a middle of the day dose and she couldn't get by with it. But that's where we had a tablet, and she actually now just substitutes her tablet when she goes out for lunch, and that works well for her. But it was just amazing that she found another problem was getting out and about. It was, but that was amazing to hear that she hadn't been visiting with her friends for about 3 years.
Yeah, wow.
And she doesn't have zero pain. There's no question. She still lives with pain, but is definitely manageable, and her quality of life is incredibly different.
Yeah, QOL monitoring, I believe they call it. Is that, if I'm not mistaken? Another really interesting area that we need to ask you about is personnel, staffing, cannabis. Yeah. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that first, and I'd also love to hear a little bit about, maybe there's people listening or watching that are interested in getting into the field. What are the types of things? Everybody comes up and they joke, oh, you're a drug dealer, you're in, and then they're like, by the way, like, can I get a job? Like trimming weed, you know what I mean? Like blah, blah, blah. You've heard them all. But in all seriousness, what are cannabis companies looking for if they're looking to hire? Is it more on the farm side? Is it more on the pharmaceutical side? I'm very curious to get your perspective on this.
Look, and this is something, and I can only speak about what I look for us and for Entoura. Sure. Because I'm very big, we talk about living our values all of the time. And so different companies would have different values to that. And on the hiring front, shout out, I am actually looking for an MSL in Sydney. So anyone in New South Wales looking for a job, don't hesitate to talk to me. But it's been really interesting. One of the things that I have learnt through the people I've worked with in my career is that you need to surround yourself with the people who do things better than you do. So if you've got some weaknesses, make sure you put in your team around you.
That's everyone for me.
Well, you get a great big team then, Mitch. But no, in all honesty, put the people in your team who don't do things as well as you, because that means you're going to have a really good balance. But when it comes back down to, I know a lot of cannabis companies talk about patient first, but we really truly live and breathe that in Entoura. And I am really thankful that Ian Brighthope as a founder gives me the scope to do that. And I think that's the answer. That first AP application that I put a lot of time and effort into, that was not for an Entoura product. There was not a single Entoura product in there. So we were helping doctors prescribe other products, and we live and breathe by that. So that's a fundamental element for us, is that when I'm looking to recruit, I'm looking to recruit someone who's actually willing to come on board with me about the reason they're in there. So one of the questions I ask in that is, why have you applied for this job? And if they tell me they're just trying to get a promotion, one person told me, oh, cannabis is a new next best thing. Sorry, as far as I'm concerned, that's not the right motivation to be there. Yeah. The answer is you actually have to understand what we're doing, because both of you gentlemen know this is not an easy industry to be in. There is a lot of red tape. There's a lot of bureaucracy. As rewarding as it is, I think there's just as many frustrations. The things it seems to be, and I was having a couple of conversations with 2 different other companies this week, that every time you turn around and you think you've got something sorted, some new unique problem comes up. So you have to be tenacious, and you actually have to be really flexible. So if you're not in it for the right reasons in the first place, which is the patient, I don't think you're not going to work out in Entoura. That's one of the things I'll tell you.
It's funny because those who know me, I come from a bit of a let's say plant background within my family, and we actually put patients second. The first thing we put at the front is plants. Plants are first.
Very good point.
And patients are second.
I get that. But I suppose for us, from a hiring perspective, then what I look for is, because I've got a really strong quality background, I've got a really strong science background, a business background, but I'm not a pharmacist and I'm not a doctor.
Sure.
So one of the things that I actually had, my first
good disclaimer there. Good little disclaimer.
Good disclaimer. Sometimes I have conversations where people think I've got more qualifications than I have. But so the first thing is, the first person I had on the road was actually a pharmacist, and so that was, firstly, credibility with the doctors. The doctors then knew they were talking to someone who actually understood medications and medicine.
Sure.
And understood, and they could have really serious conversations about drug-to-drug interactions and the pharmacology. And then for me, and then when that person happened to get a job over, their husband got a job over in England and left me, I knew I wanted to replace them with the pharmacist. So of my team on the road, I've currently got 2 pharmacists, and I will always make sure that I've got at least 1 pharmacist out in that space. Yep. And that also means that the other people in the road, if they've got any of those pharmacy type of questions, they've got someone just in their hand, just ask that question for. We work really collaboratively. The rest of the team on the road have then got different backgrounds, from pharmaceutical, repping to nursing, to other different bits and pieces. But for me, it is that attitude, but it's that element. And the other thing that I really want people to think about is, people who come from that typical pharmaceutical sales background are very used to their script of what they do. They've got their product portfolio, they know their patients, they know the target doctors, etc., and they get very good at talking about that. You need to be able to talk about, I suppose I put it that I do payroll, like I might be doing payroll or actually doing entering customer orders one day. Then the next day I might be, as I was at one point in time, sitting next to Scott Morrison having lunch. And it's not always that big of diversity, but you do need to have. What was that one?
I think I'd rather do payroll, to be honest.
Yes, it was a little while ago, but it was an interesting one, an interesting conversation. It was before the last election, that was, but anyway.
Okay. No.
Yeah, but I suppose one of the things in this industry, and again, that's what you have to want to be here, because I think you ultimately end up doing a lot more diverse things than you ever would do in another place. Like my people on the road, they've helped us with technical content. They're delivering webinars, and that's stuff that you might not do if you're in a bigger company, or if you're in a different industry. So I think, but some of the challenges then is actually finding the people to fit that mindset, because you're getting people who want to do it because the next buzz thing, or often what you're getting is people who've got a massive experience, and in the pharmaceutical industry, we know that they pay really, really well at times. So sometimes it's a bit of a challenge, because we are a startup industry, and a few years down the track, but I still think we display the attributes to the startup industry still, that sometimes that even the bigger players, we can't pay what a pharmaceutical company would pay you. So there's sometimes that gap you have to manage as well.
And curiosity.
Sorry, I got one question about the how everyone at cannabis companies has to wear many hats. Have you had to do any appointments at Customs House, getting import permits endorsed or anything like that?
No, haven't been down at Customs House yet, but have been doing very interesting things. And I certainly have. I've gone out and done the doctor's appointments, so I've actually done my stint on the road MSLing. My team laugh at me at that. They think I talk well and talk a good game. But I suppose with the doctors, I'm like I am with you. I just impart what I know, tell them what I don't, and but no, I haven't had to go down for that front. But I have wished I could have at times. I really wanted to get myself. If I had have been in Germany, there was one point in time I would have been knocking on the German authorities' doors, and I would have actually quite literally sat at their door until someone spoke to me. So.
I've got a quick question around people wanting to get into the industry. You've spoken about people with medical backgrounds, people that have kind of the tenacity of putting or the integrity, putting patients first, for example. What about people who quote unquote have a passion or come from the existing maybe underground network of cannabis in Australia already? If you find somebody who's been, for lack of a better term, living and breathing it for a while, in maybe ways that were, not so
living and inhaling it or vaping it, perhaps.
You're saying they're in that little grey space.
Correct. It's not even grey, but yeah.
trying to be polite here. I'm a non-discriminatory person. I'm not going to frown again. Certainly, I now, as I said, I run a medicinal cannabis company. My father's was a truck driver by trade. I've learnt never to judge a book by its cover. And growing up, he was still one of the most intelligent people I'd ever known, and he only went to school to year 8. So my answer is, I'm more concerned about your character and your work ethic and what you display, as opposed to where your background comes from. Yep. How can you fault someone for passionately believing in something? It might be illegal, and we're not talking about they're passionately believing in cooking ice, which harms others. They've been passionately believing in a product to actually help people or help themselves, etc. So obviously the one thing is they have to be squeaky clean from the law perspective now, or else I can't employ them.
Yeah.
But from the perspective of their background, if they've got knowledge that can come to us and help us, I'd be silly not to consider it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's very interesting for all those listeners out there that might have different past history.
The probably the counter side to that is that we're not in the growing space, and the other thing is they're probably going to get a little bit bored by our industry. Going back to what you said, Andrew, that SOP space. Yeah. We are very structured in the way we have to work. So I know a lot of people are stunned by that. So
you'd be surprised though. I remember I was working on a farm in deep Northwest America for about a year. And let's just say that not every person in that town of 800 people was educated or had been to university or even finished high school or didn't know a lot about the outside world. I'm not here to judge, but they just had a very narrow experience to that point. However, when we got to the topic of cannabis, they became MSLs. Like they became biochemical engineers. They actually knew the ratios, the point at which the THCA molecule decarboxylates, how to make resin, how to distill it. And I was just like, what am I actually listening to? You don't actually know. You think the Middle East is next to the Pacific Northwest, but you actually don't know that. But all this specialist information about purifying cannabis into all different forms and extracts. And I was just blown away by how much that passion can take somebody who otherwise doesn't know as much and give them some kind of superlative knowledge on
it worked for you, definitely.
Yeah, so that's all I know about cannabis and podcasts.
But I think that's the beauty of it, and I think that's anything to do with life. And I think that's one of the things, and I'm getting a bit philosophical here, that the pandemic has possibly taught us is that we have to do things that make us happy. And if you're doing things that make you happy, look, this is what's happened with me. I call it getting stuck down the rabbit hole. I read a clinical paper and then I go, but where did they get that part from? And then I actually click on the next reference, the next one. And it's because it genuinely interests me. And whether that's cannabis or whether it's anything if you find something that you touch on, it makes you happy, you're ultimately going to become the expert just because you can't get enough of it.
Yeah. So, and it's either that or late night cat videos on YouTube.
Correct.
I've noticed everyone's become an expert as well. Like in the early days of the pandemic, it was getting briefings from government. Now you could be getting a coffee at the the shop, chatting to the barista, and they're saying, a little bit concerned about the contact tracing efforts that we're seeing in some of the hotspots. I noticed there's quite a considerable degree of vaccine hesitancy in the community. That can obviously be overcome if we roll out at a faster rate than we currently are. So as you say, Mitch, it's acquired knowledge driven by passion, or perhaps necessity in the case of COVID.
Nothing else to talk about in the case of COVID.
Yeah,
indeed. Well, I didn't have any further questions, but I'm sure I'll think of a few after we jump off this. Did you have any more, Mitch?
Well, just our obligatory final comment, I think, or final question that we usually ask on this podcast. You may have seen it before, Claire, but legalization, recreational, what do you think?
And
how far away?
Yeah, will
it happen?
Will Entoura have a line of joints that they make available, or what's the product planning in the recreational space looking like for you guys?
But more so the time.
Yeah, so I can answer both questions, and I have no hesitancy in answering both questions. So it's a really interesting one. I have to say I've miserably failed in my first ever prediction in this space. I predicted by now that we would actually have CBD in pharmacy, and I thought we'd have it by the end of last year. And I was even hopeful that might have been even a step down from Schedule 3. So my first prediction totally failed. So don't put any money on what I say.
Done.
But we have actually, interestingly, had this conversation quite extensively. And I think, I used to think 5 to 10 years. I'm actually probably closer to 5 years now. I actually have revised myself down a little bit. Mm-hmm. And I think that is due to the patient population and push within Australia. I think this is a topic that that is very patient pushed, and I think there's going to be a point where there is possibly going to be some change. The counter side to that is that I suppose my background with the regulators and understanding them and understanding their risk profiles, et cetera, I think they're going to find it hard on the actual to down schedule or to get it stepped through down on that actual medicinal space. So I think things like what the ACT's done is probably where the movement's going to come through rather than any other kind of space. So therefore, I think that's why I scale it down a little bit. But yeah, don't place money on my bet.
THC as well. THC, you reckon 5 years?
Well, it is in ACT.
Yeah, I think so, because I don't think if you're going into that adult use market or the recreational market, whatever you call it, I don't think they can discriminate. I don't think, because you're going to be at the stage of growing plants, and you're going to be at like personal use growth of plants and things like that, or you're more traditional, like this type of shops you get over in the US, and I don't think they're going to be able to keep THC out of it. Yeah. I still think, in one of the topics that I know you've had lots of conversations, driving is still a very big sticking point, and we're very conservative on that front here in Australia. So I think that more than anything might hold things up, but I don't know.
Good point.
Yeah, I think I think you're exactly right that ACT model could be potentially the way that it all falls. It's interesting. We chatted with your mate Kylie O'Brien about the prospect of actually just getting medicinal cannabis taken off the schedules, full stop, in that sort of complementary medicine style. But I know there's a lot of companies out there that are obviously have invested quite a bit in clinical trials and wanting to sort of be first to market with an S3 and all that. Personally, I think that I think all of that's overkill, but I'd really like to see it taken off the schedules, but or at least anything non-psychoactive. But we can.
Look, and I'm very much so. I wrote a white paper on how it could actually be regulated somewhere between the complementary medicine space and pharmaceutical space back in 2017. And with my knowledge of the regulations, I believe it can be, and I believe a CBD product can be. And look, I'm a really big supporter of the TGA. I just think in some respects they got caught up without being able to see the wood for the trees a little bit on that. And I've worked closely with Kylie on that down scheduling, and I'm big and the descheduling element and the proposal that she put in. So that's on that front. Then to answer your other question, Andrew, the answer is the world is our oyster. We could do anything, and
that's what I wanted to hear.
I can tell you from the moment we've got long-term plans, and our strategic plan for Entoura absolutely posed the question and considered the recreational space. Excellent. The answer is we are first and foremost about the patient, about healthcare. You may laugh about this, but Ian and I talk about world peace, and that is actually features on our business plan in the top corner as a little bit of a world peace symbol. And that is because he's a firm believer, if you can actually get the nutritional balance right in people, that they are generally happier and you'll actually have a more peaceful world. So if we are doing it in a responsible manner, again, one of the reasons I love the complementary medicine space here in Australia is because it is regulated in a way that's not regulated in anywhere else in the world. So if you can give a safe, effective, constant product to people that is actually going to do them good and not harm, and if Entoura can be part of that, we will. but we are primarily here under the pharmaceuticals model, the medicine model at the moment. But if there is a responsible way that we can actually step through that as it changes, if you can't evolve with the business, you're going to get left behind.
It's a very responsible statement. I like how it was structured.
I have been asked this before. I've thought about it.
I might have noticed that. Yeah, it's very good. Fantastic. Well, I think that possibly brings. I could talk for another 3 hours, but we might just have to get you back on for another episode in future months.
Yeah, I'd love to, because there's a whole heap of other different bits and pieces that I'd love to talk to you about, a little bit about DVA funding and a whole heap of different bits and pieces. But it's been wonderful talking tonight, and more than happy to come back whenever you'd like.
Oh, thanks, Claire.
Pleasure to have you. Yeah, it's been great. And just quick shout out to my mum. Really appreciate the unintended cameo. So I think she's the first uninvited guest that's made her way onto the podcast.
Oh, we had Steve NG's dog that dug a hole into his couch.
Yeah,
in the week.
There you go.
That's true.
So that's what happens, Andrew, when you escape Melbourne to get out of the lockdown.
I got out of the ring of steel and I thought I was in the clear, but now I've got mum interrupting my podcast down here on the Great Ocean Road.
That's so 2021. Mum interrupted my podcast. That's the most lockdown statement I think I've ever heard.
I'll have that as my my update on Facebook and Twitter for the next 24 hours. Thank you so much. It has been our pleasure, and really want to unpack DVA funding and a few other topics. We could talk driving. There's quite a bit, so we'll save it all up for next time. But thank you so much, and take care and best wishes with everything, all the great work you're doing in Entoura.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. And and the other thing I want to say is I'm really pleased to be on here because I love listening to your podcast. Keep up the good work.
Thank you. We'll hopefully get a few more likes with this episode. We'll until next time, we'll speak soon.
Thanks, you so much, guys.
Bye. Cheers.